In 1920, the American recording industry operated under a strict demographic model, targeting a single, homogeneous market: white, middle-class consumers. Record label executives operated on a firm premise. They assumed that Black Americans lacked both the disposable income to purchase records and the hardware required to play them. By strictly adhering to this demographic bias, the industry created a massive market inefficiency. Millions of potential consumers were completely excluded from the economic loop, leaving vast amounts of capital on the table. The segregation of early music catalogs was a self-inflicted commercial blind spot. Labels were artificially capping their own growth by relying on an unverified assumption about who could and would buy music. That assumption collapsed in New York City. The city's recording studios became the testing ground for the industry's eventual market correction. A singer named Mamie Smith entered a studio to record Crazy Blues. Her presence in the recording booth directly challenged established commercial protocols. The resulting record sold 75,000 copies in its first month. For the 1920s, this volume of sales was a staggering statistical anomaly. Caught off guard by this unexpected demand, the industry scrambled to categorize it. They introduced the term race records, a label designed to isolate and contain music performed by and marketed to Black Americans. The sales figures forced an immediate operational pivot. Labels quickly dispatched talent scouts to the South to record blues singers, gospel quartets, and jazz ensembles, competing to capitalize on this newly verified market. Mamie Smith's recording provided the definitive empirical proof. The industry had to acknowledge and immediately begin supplying a massive parallel economy. This visual comparison shows early commercial catalogs. On one side, you have the mainstream pop listings, and on the other, the specialized race record inventory. The consumer market was now explicitly bifurcated. This separation allowed Black-owned labels to step in and capture the margins. Black Swan Records, for example, emerged to control the entire economic value chain, from contracting recording artists to managing the pressing operations. Because mainstream retail stores often refused to stock these records, labels developed entirely new distribution networks. Independent agents sold records out of suitcases, barbershops, and pharmacies to reach Black consumers directly. To market these records, the labels relied heavily on Black-owned media. Publications like the Chicago Defender became the primary advertising infrastructure for this independent ecosystem. By the mid-1920s, the scale of this operation was immense. The race records category was generating 5 to 6 million individual record sales every single year. The major labels intended to wall off this demographic. By doing so, they provided the capital and the boundaries necessary for a robust, independent commercial infrastructure to flourish. The scale of this market was driven by a massive demographic shift known as the Great Migration. Millions of African Americans relocated from the rural South to the industrial North, seeking economic opportunity and fleeing racial violence. This movement created highly concentrated urban consumer hubs. This map illustrates how the physical distribution of records mapped directly onto these migration corridors. The same railroad networks carrying passengers north also shipped thousands of blues and jazz records back down to southern markets. Record labels and pressing plants quickly established their headquarters at the terminus points of these routes, anchoring their operations directly inside these booming northern hubs. This physical concentration of people packed immense purchasing power into distinct metropolitan zones. It allowed for rapid cultural exchange and accelerated the velocity of record sales. The migration patterns transformed what was previously categorized as a regional folk sound into a highly organized national economic force. In the 1930s, America was defined by strict physical boundaries. Lunch counters, theaters, and neighborhoods were rigidly segregated by law. But the recording industry faced a phenomenon of acoustic permeability. Jim Crow laws could dictate where a person sat on a bus, but they could not prevent radio signals from crossing property lines. White teenagers across the country began turning their radio dials to Black stations. Hearing the music over the airwaves drove them to retail stores to purchase titles specifically from the race catalogs. The specific musical mechanics developed inside these isolated catalogs, the complex swing rhythms, the call and response structures, the flattened blue notes, were actively being absorbed across demographics. These techniques formed the structural DNA of rock and roll. This shared auditory experience eventually manifested in physical spaces. Jazz clubs and dance halls began seeing integrated audiences, driven together by a mutual demand for the product. By the late 1940s, consumer behavior had completely outgrown the segregated marketing categories. The financial walls meant to contain the music were failing. Going into the final years of the decade, the accounting departments at major labels faced a stark reality. Black music was a primary engine driving total industry revenue. The objective measure of this success was Billboard magazine, the central ledger tracking where American consumers actually spent their money. In 1949, Jerry Wexler, a producer and reporter for Billboard, proposed abolishing the race records moniker entirely. Wexler argued that the label was both culturally derogatory and economically inaccurate. A categorization based entirely on race could no longer map a market where mass crossover sales were the norm. The publication implemented a new genre label, rhythm and blues. This adjustment acknowledged the commercial power of the music without assigning a mandatory demographic. This linguistic shift marked an institutional surrender. The industry abandoned its segregated charts because the data proved the model was obsolete. As the 1950s accelerated, the rhythm and blues and pop charts rapidly merged. Artists like Chuck Berry took the frameworks forged in isolated studios and turned them into the dominant sound of the American mainstream. The recording industry's early history presents a clear structural paradox. The race record category was designed as a tool of exclusion, built to keep a specific demographic marginalized in the market. Instead, it provided Black artists the specific, measurable commercial space needed to prove their economic necessity. This exclusionary marketing built the commercial bridge, allowing American culture to finally cross the color line. This was brought to you by Notes and Silences. Thank you for listening.